Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Well, thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here again today with my colleagues Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and Gail Carpenter, Assistant Professor and State Dairy Extension Specialist, as we introduce the second virtual discussion on successful forage feeding. So welcome back to the podcast, Gail and Fred.
Great to be here.
Yeah, so this week you had another topic of discussion for the forage and feeding webinars. And who were your presenters and where did that discussion lead this week?
Well, this week's discussion topic was cover crops. So for most of our sessions, we're focusing on corn silage in particular. This week, we really focused on utilizing cover crops from an agronomic perspective, but also from a nutrition and feeding perspective. So I thought it was some really great discussion. We had Daniel Olson with Forage Innovations to kind of talk about the feeding side of things on dairy farms and how it can work with a feed system on dairies. And then we had Rebecca Vittatoe from ISU Extension. She's one of our field agronomists. And so she was able to bring kind of that agronomic perspective in. I thought we had some really great discussion. What did you think, Fred?
Oh, I thought we brought two different perspectives to the table as far as, how forage is utilized and how the cover crop can be brought in to the forage system.
And I don't know about you, I thought that this was probably, for people who are just kind of starting to explore utilizing cover crops in their system, whether it's from a conservation standpoint or from a forage standpoint, I thought it was probably some discussion that's pretty good for an entry point for some of those folks. But also, I think, if you're already using cover crops, there's probably things that you could have gotten out of the discussion well. So I think we hit on topics that would appeal to a lot of different folks with a lot of different levels of experience in the cover crop area.
I think we got into the nuts and bolts of things. We talked about varieties. We talked about, okay, what is your window if you're going to put in a crop post silage harvest? How many days do you really have that you will collect enough energy to germinate and be able to utilize that crop in the spring? So yeah, I think whether you've been using cover crops for many years or whether you're just considering, brought a lot of information to the table.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great to hear. And we will, after this introduction here, kind of lead into their discussion there. So it'll be our field agronomist, Rebecca Vittatoe, and Daniel Olson with Forage Innovations leading that discussion with Gail and Fred there. But Gail, before we end, why don't you give us some more detail on what's coming up next week as well?
Yeah, so next week, another exciting topic. I don't know. I always say all of these topics are exciting. I get excited about all of these topics. But next week, we're going to be talking about forage storage. And we kind of started talking about that a little bit last week with Bill Bahana and Aaron Mawson. But we're really going to get into a lot more of the details on forage storage, particularly ensiled forages and ensiled corn silage. So best practices there when it comes to storage and feed out of our silage. And we are going to be having Dr. Luis Ferretto from the University of Wisconsin Extension. He's done a lot of research in this area and a lot of extension work in this area. So he's very knowledgeable when it comes to corn silage in particular. And then we're also going to have Ron and Connie Kuber from Connor AgriScience. So we're going to have some industry folks on as well to talk about some best practices there. We're also going to get a little bit more into safety. As we talked about last week, it's a really important topic. So we're going to hit on that a little bit more this coming week as well. So I expect to have, a variety of different things that we hit, a lot of pretty practical stuff that can be useful for everyone as we move into this corn silage harvest season.
For those folks who don't recognize the name of Ron and Connie Kuber, they have a oxygen barrier cover for silos that they've developed, and it's used across the country. In fact, the ISU dairy herd silage pile has got that cover over it.
That's right.
Well, that all sounds great, Fred and Gail. And just for our audience, I will include the registration link in case we get people on here that haven't registered for those webinars. They can do that, as well as I'll include the archived link to the webinars in case they haven't viewed them and would like to go back and review those. With that, I think we'll lead into the discussion point, and we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
To go ahead and kick off discussion, I'll go ahead and ask a question for both of our speakers, Daniel and Rebecca. I don't know if everybody else has The Princess Bride memorized like me, but one of the lines in there is about falling victim to one of the classic blunders. I'd like to know, either of you, what are the classic blunders when it comes to starting off cover crops? Cover crops for conservation or soil health purposes, but also cover crops for feeding. Where are some common areas that you see people make mistakes or trip up when they're starting to utilize more cover crops in their forage systems?
Okay, well, I guess I'll go first. The first thing is probably, like I said, I just finished up my talk talking about it, but when we're talking about forages, is underestimating how quickly cereal rye can mature in the spring. And you have, especially if you bite off a lot, you have a lot of acres, you have a custom harvester coming in, you don't get them scheduled properly, you don't have enough equipment to handle the acres that you need to handle in that short period of time. And then if you have bad weather, that compounds the problems, wet soils or things early in the spring. I would say probably the first one, underestimating how quickly cereal rye can mature in the spring, lose that optimal harvest window for dairy quality feed.
One that I think of is just not thinking about the role Mother Nature plays. And, 1 year something works really, really good. And then the next, just because we have a totally different growing season, it might not work the same. And so just not being prepared for not the inconsistencies that we can see from 1 year to the next. I think of 2017 when we grazed our cover crops in our grazing cover crop study. It worked out awesome. We had over a month and a half of grazing. It was wonderful. And then the next year, we maybe had a week of grazing just because of the growing conditions that we had. So just I think that's the big one, just how much it can vary from 1 year to the next and not accounting for that.
Well, if it doesn't work, the thing to do is first of all, always blame your extension agent, and then you can move on down the line. But always start with blaming the extension agent.
I thought people started with blaming the nutritionist. This is new information to me.
Yeah, well, that's what they come on here for, learn new things.
Another one I would add, and it's more so after the cover crop, is so when we go to plant that cash crop back into where we had that cover crop, where I will get called out to fields because the cash crop doesn't look right, is not having the planter set right. And so just because we're planting into different residue than maybe what we're used to. And so just getting out and making sure that planter is set right. So if we harvest rye and then we want to plant corn back there for silage, making sure that planter is set right.
We've got a question that's come in from the audience concerning interseeding cover crop with corn silage. For example, does a cover crop take nutrients such as nitrogen from the corn grain crop or corn silage crop?
So I guess what time are you when you say interseeding? Because I kind of think of some different windows for interseeding. So we can interseed, later in the season. So when that corn canopy starts to open up, or people are looking at interseeding earlier in the growing season. So like when that corn's anywhere from like V2 to V5, V6. So I guess that would be my question to better answer that question back.
Nutrients are just, the percentage times the dry matter, really. I mean, that's all it is. So the more growth you have, the more nutrients it's going to take up. And once again, if you're doing nitrogen, that's pretty easy to do those. If we have 1,000 pounds of dry matter out there of growth and it's 20% protein, well, we have 200 pounds of protein. We have, you can divide that out and you can see how many pounds of nitrogen we're taking up at that point in time. It's just a matter of how much growth. Now, the one thing you may see the next spring, and I'm sure I could talk to this, is there is also below ground and even stubble that there are some nutrients there that are stabilized or tied up for a period of time. Like if I'm following a rye, especially if it's just rye, and it also if it was more mature with a corn crop, I'm going to want to front load my nitrogen a little bit just to make sure enough early on until that residue, whether it's roots or whether it's above ground, breaks down. It'll be released eventually, but up front, I'd like to just slide some of that nitrogen back.
I would echo that from a nitrogen perspective. I know the research Iowa State's done, it doesn't say that we need to necessarily change the total amount of nitrogen that we put on to raise a corn crop with a cover crop, but it might be that we put some on like at planting or close to planting just to help that corn crop get going. Because that nitrogen or those other nutrients will become available later as that residue breaks down if there's any there. The other comment I would add to the interseeding cover crop for corn silage, if we interseed that earlier in the growing season, I'd be cautious what species we do. We want to use more shade tolerant species that are going to be staying underneath that corn canopy. I'd also want to double check our herbicides that we're using to make sure we're on label with those from a feed perspective. And then also, if it's not, usually we see that cover crop kind of hang out there, and then it's going to really start growing once we get that cash crop off there. So I don't think we don't need to make too many major changes there from a nitrogen perspective or worry about it stealing too much nitrogen from our corn crop.
Right now we're planting into some farms in northeastern Wisconsin, doing cover crops into cornfields with drones. So going to be doing that this week. And using more shade tolerant things, which are generally legumes. Ryegrass, annual ryegrass can be as well. But for the most part, I've had the best success with legumes. And part of that might be just a seed soil contact thing as well. If you picture a seed sifting down from the sky and penetrating through a canopy and getting into the soil, something that's round and hard like a legume seed versus something that's light and fluffy like a small grain or a ryegrass, that could have something to do with it. And also, we talked about herbicides. Brassicas are very, very sensitive to herbicides, it seems. So tillage radishes, things like that, any sort of residual herbicide this time of year, hard to get them established.
So we got a response to your follow-up question to the question, Rebecca, about when you're interseeding. You can help me clarify if you know what this is getting at. But Farm Magazine picture corn silage height or corn shoulder height. I'm assuming not my shoulder, but maybe an adult man's shoulder, with cereal grain growing as a double crop.
At that point, it's trying to interseed rye, like cereal rye, earlier into a standing corn crop earlier in the growing season. I would recommend probably more of an annual ryegrass because it's more shade tolerant. Cereal rye, it might get started, but we just don't see it really do much or take much, or it could start and then it doesn't do anything. So I'm guessing, later in the season, like this time of year, as that corn canopy starts to open up, we see those corn plants drying down, interseeding, whether it's with a drone or, like a Hagee Highboy or an aerial application with an airplane. That's a common thing to do to try and get that cover crop, rye cover crop going earlier. So, and I wouldn't worry too much about it taking too much nitrogen away from the corn.
One thing I would say is that if you're going to grow triticale, triticale needs to be drilled. It needs to be drilled for winter hardiness. It'll germinate, it'll look good in the fall on surface type applications, but it needs to be drilled. And I like it like 1.25 inches. Get that growing point down. If you have an open winter, you have cold, you have ice, triticale will winter kill if it's not planted deep enough. And so just surface applying it, flying it on, broadcasting it, it's not good enough. It's drilled. Cereal rye, you can throw that in your gravel driveway, it'll come up, but not triticale. I probably mentioned this just because it's If any of you have seen me and my stuff, something I really like and I'm excited about is cocktail mixes. And I like growing them full season cocktail mixes in between years of corn. And so, you know, understanding that first year corn is the most profitable, productive crop we can grow on almost any farm in the country. It yields on average are 15% higher than, you know, corn on corn systems. You know, we have less herbicide issues, we have less trait cost, we have less insect pressure. It's just all these things, generally speaking, get easier on first year corn. Besides, you know, the fixed costs are spread out over more bushels. And so, you know, the challenge is like, how do you get more acres of first year corn? And if you have dairy cattle or enough enough cattle to feed it to, I really like this idea of planting these full season cover crop mixes, cocktail mixes in years of, and those can, you know, have a whole bunch of different things depending when you're planting them, what your goals are for quality, but things like all those things I started talking about, like EMR sorghum sudan or millet or clovers or vetch or ryegrass, or, you know, there's lots of different things that can go into those. The neat thing is it sets you up for success the next year, and we can pretty much break not just weed cycles, we can break insect cycles depending on what our breakdown is, you know, and dramatically lower the cost to grow a bushel of corn. Now that's assuming you have cattle to feed these too, but there's certainly an opportunity. And I think if we really are serious about including cover crops in rotations, especially if we're just growing grain on those acres, we need to think about maybe taking some of those acres and actually growing more full season crops in between. So for instance, last year, I grew a cover crop mix that was, it started off with peas, oats, Italian ryegrass, red clover, berseem clover, hairy vetch, and a hybrid brassica, just a little bit. And we took 4 cuttings off of that last year. And this spring, I had red clover and hairy vetch and berseem clover that was about, you know, just a thick mat of that out there. And so we went in, we no-tilled corn into that when it was, the clover was about 12 inches high or so. And I went back out a week later, I was gonna spray it, and I kind of forgot about it. And the corn was already spiking and the clover was like knee high. It was like too much clover. And I was like, whoa, I'm not sure if I can even, you know, if it's going to start shading my corn out, if it'll die quick enough. So we actually went out and harvested it then and made baleage off of it with spiking corn underneath it. And then we went out a week or 10 days later and sprayed off the clover. And all I used was like a quart of Roundup. The idea was to just make it, I actually didn't want to kill it. I just wanted to like set it back. And I thought, well, maybe we could get in a system where we could be, I mean, just if you could make it work, think about planting corn every year into a perennial clover stand, where every year you're planting corn into it, you're burning it so it dies back dramatically, then it kind of recovers through the year, and the next year you turn around and you no-till corn right back into it. So I think in the end I pretty well fried it, so we'll see how much of it comes back in the spring. But we're growing first year corn with almost no fertility added, and it looks pretty good. But this was a tremendous clover stand and hairy vetch and other legumes.
Rebecca, any comments about cocktail mixes? We have a question in the chat about, after silage comes off, going to plant triticale for spring forage. Are there other species that could be mixed in with triticale to help with ground condition the following spring, to help mellow ground out, to no-till corn the following spring? So we have a specific question, but in general, Rebecca, did you also have anything to add to the discussion about cocktails?
Yeah, so probably the biggest challenge I have with cocktails is going back to what herbicides were on the field or applied to the field the year before, and legally staying on with those herbicide labels to be able to plant something else. So I mean, like brassicas would work really well to help with the, mellow the ground. But one of the issues we have with some of our herbicide products are, can we legally plant brassicas? It doesn't necessarily mean that we would have issues. It's just, it's not on the label and we have to follow those herbicide labels. So that's, from an agronomy perspective, that's the issue I run into with trying to do some of those cocktail mixes and use them from a forage perspective. So just double checking those to make sure that we're on label and doing that.
Are you, Rebecca, are you concerned about, is it that it would kill them, or or is it actually not legal?
So more so that it's not legal per the herbicide label, that we're using it as a forage source. And then also I'm probably more cautious on the dairy side, just because I don't want any residues to potentially show up in the milk. Whereas, on the beef cattle side, I don't worry about it quite as much, but on the dairy side, it's something I just want to caution people on.
So like what I'll do, like following corn in the fall, if we get corn silage off soon enough, like there's some guys in Iowa that's going to be chopping in the next, 10 days, maybe. It's starting. We'll plant winter triticale, a winter hardy annual ryegrass, and a pound or two of tillage radishes. And maybe if they value some nitrogen, we'll throw a couple pounds of red clover and a couple pounds of hairy vetch. So 75 pounds of trit, 5 pounds of ryegrass, 2 pounds of clover, 2 pounds radish, and 2 pounds hairy vetch, something like that. That fibrous root system of a ryegrass can do wonders. Our tillage radishes are gonna winter kill, so it's not a factor from a feeding standpoint. And then the clover and the ryegrass and the triticale will be there in the spring for a harvest. Now, if you're doing a fall harvest, then that probably makes a bigger difference. You want to be careful on your herb. And so what we're doing now, like quite a few of my guys with open ground, like we had wheat coming off, vegetables in some areas, and even if corn silage comes off early enough down south, I got a farm in Missouri, we're doing a bunch of it, where we'll plant forage oats and winter triticale and some of these other things together in end of August, 1st of September. And we'll take a cutting in the fall, and then we'll have the triticale and the other things in the spring again. And as long as we leave about 4 inches of residual, that triticale and everything will come back again for us the next cuttings off of one pass, planting a mix.
Rebecca, any comments about, Daniel kind of alluded to the listener question about species that can be mixed with triticale. Any comments about specifically species that can be mixed in to help with ground condition for no-till corn?
Yeah, I mean, the triticale will do a really good job with the root system that it has. I think people underestimate sometimes, whether it's the triticale or the rye, what those fibrous root systems will do. If compaction's a concern, or they're concerned about, a hard pan and wanting to break some of that up, sometimes those brassicas can do a really good job, like those tillage radishes. The biggest thing is getting them seeded early enough, which if we're doing it after corn silage in Iowa, we typically don't have an issue with that, as long as they're getting it seeded, and that can help really well.
Yeah, so Noah, where you are in central Wisconsin, I'd love to say we could put some ryegrass with your triticale or something, but this year I highly doubt we're going to have corn silage off soon enough to make that happen. If you go back to one of my first slides there, ryegrass really, it should be planted by the 10th of September, probably, to get winter hardiness out of it. I think you're going to be on the edge this year for even triticale, probably getting it in by, say, the 1st of October. And so that's the challenge we have farther north. Or the farther south you go in the Midwest, it opens up a lot more opportunities, but we struggle up here.
So a question, both of you could answer this potentially. What are some differences that we might see if we're looking for cover crops as a feed? And Rebecca did a great job talking about grazing, and Daniel's talked a little about grazing as well as some stored forages. But if we're actually going to be storing and harvesting our cover crop forages as a silage versus grazing, are there different considerations that we need to have when choosing the varieties as well as managing and growing those different varieties?
When I think about, different, especially grasses that we might plant that we want to then harvest in the spring as a forage. So I'm thinking more so like chopping it for silage. Some of it depends a little bit on how soon do you want it and when are we going to reach that stage to when we would want to chop it for silage. So typically, I get a lot of questions about like rye, triticale, and wheat, and which one's going to be the best there. Any of them work really well. Typically your cereal rye will be ready to chop before your triticale. It's usually about a week to 2 weeks here in Iowa before it's ready, depending upon the spring. Then you're going to have your triticale. So you're looking at about a week to 2 weeks after that rye. And usually that rye, it depends upon the year, but usually it's the middle of May here in Iowa when I see it ready. And then your wheat's going to probably be 2 or 3 weeks after your rye. So it kind of depends a little bit on what is your system looking like and what are you going to want to plant back after you harvest it, as far as which species might you want to plant, but any of them can work. So it just kind of depends upon what you're going to plant back and how soon do you want to plant it back. The other comment I would add on the agronomy side is, if we're chopping corn silage and we're taking the corn silage off, and then we're also chopping and taking the cover crop off, is thinking about how much P and K are we removing with those cover crops in that corn silage, and how much should we be putting back on that field to help continue those crops growing in future years, especially potassium. We take a lot of potassium off when we harvest those forages like that. Whereas, if we're grazing it, I don't worry about that because they're putting the manure back out there. And so those nutrients are getting cycled. But when we're harvesting, that is something to consider. And it depends to what your soil fertility levels are too.
Yeah, for grazing considerations, what a lot of farms will do is they'll plant the cover crop in the fall. They'll graze beef cattle or something on it over winter, maybe with corn stalks or something, and then maybe in the spring graze it or whatever, or harvest it. It's pretty typical to graze beef cattle on cover crops over winter to extend that fall out. And the main issue with that, when it's small grains especially, is that you leave some residual. I see some of these, triticale fields or whatever, and they just, they graze it to the ground, and they're just overstocking. They're feeding round bales and whatever with the beef cattle, and there's no residual. And it's really important to leave about 4 inches of above ground growth on especially trid or wheat, and to some extent rye. Raise into that. You may not kill it, but you'll dramatically reduce yields in the spring. And that little bit that they took in the fall, it's not worth up in the spring. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing, you are grazing warm seasons in the fall, especially sorghum or sorghum sudan or sudan grass. Prussic acid is some compounds that are in the cell wall, and when it freezes, those compounds leak out and they create prussic acid, which is a gas. It volatilizes. It's basically cyanide, and it'll kill cattle. Not very often, but it happens. And I've had 2 times in the years I've been working in the forage industry that my clients have lost cattle to prussic acid. Both of them were grazing situations on mornings after frost. And one was a farm that was grazing some river bottom, didn't realize it had froze down there during the night. It hadn't froze up by the buildings, but it had froze down there. He turned the cattle out there, and he lost a half a dozen cattle that morning. The other one was heifers that were on a dry lot, actually, and they put them into a new dry lot, but they were sharing a fence with a sorghum sudan, and it froze that night, and they just were grazing under the fence enough that a number of them died. So it can happen. It's only right after a frost, from a week to 10 days or whatever that period of time is. It might only be a day. it's something to just be mindful of. Now, if you're harvesting it, it doesn't matter as long as you let it sit there long enough before you feed it. It's just a time factor from when it freezes to when you feed it. But in a grazing situation, of course, it could be that next morning, and that's the problem.
The other comment I'll add with prussic acid is we usually think of prussic acid with fall and a frost. But if we're grazing some warm season annuals like this time of year and we're in a drought situation, prussic acid could also potentially be a concern in drought conditions as well. So just something to be aware of.
Daniel, one of your opening statements was about the goals you have. So a dairyman who wants to put forage into his system for the milking herd. This is going to sound parochial, but are you looking at pounds of milk per acre or pounds of feed? How do you help meet that goal?
So a lot of it has to do with what kind of inclusion rates you're going to be feeding. How much of it do you need to feed? So a dairy ration a dairy cow has a finite amount of undigestible fiber that you can feed. And that is, if we're talking about UNDF 240s or something like that, it's maybe 5 pounds of, it'd be less than that, 3 pounds or so of undigestible fiber, or UNDF 240. And so you only have so much undigestible fiber you could feed. So if you're a farm in California that's feeding a 35% forage diet and a lot of byproducts and things, then you really value fiber, especially physical fiber that a forage like sorghum sudan or triticale can provide. And so farms in California might chop no stage triticale and feed it in lactating diets, but because we're only feeding 3.5 pounds of dry matter, it's a really good fit in a low forage diet. But if you're in the upper Midwest and you're wanting to push the limits of forage inclusion in the diet and replace concentrate, and feed a 65 or 70% forage diet, well, then the amount of fiber that you can handle becomes a lot less. And so the species that we're going to plant, the management, the harvest management gets a lot more intense and limited when we want to feed a lot of that forage. So strictly BMRs on warm season crops like millet or sorghum sudan, and probably shying away from cereal rye just because it's really hard to get it right in the spring, and going to stuff that has slower maturity like triticale or ryegrass. And those would be things that we would look at as we move into more dairy rations. But the first question is really, how much fiber are you going to feed? Or how much forage are you going to feed? And then that'll help to make those decisions about what species and what kind of management you're going to want to surround that with. Because there's a minimum and a maximum amount of fiber that you need in a ration.
And one of the things that I always like to say when we're talking about alternative forages is that all forages can be useful as long as they haven't spoiled or are very moldy. But, and you kind of alluded to this at the beginning of your presentation as well. We have heifers, we have dry cows, we have lactating cows, we have high producing lactating cows, low producing lactating cows. All forages can be useful to some extent or another, depending on what we're looking at feeding. So
yeah, this farm in Arizona that I talked about starting with, that they had 40,000 tons of a product that had a lot of fiber, but the quality of the fiber was really poor. So a non-BMR forage sorghum, and so the nutritionist was at somewhere around a pound and a half of dry matter inclusion in the ration. And the farm was hoping to be at more like 8 or 9 pounds. And so they're looking at this mountain and they're like, we're going to be years before we can move through it. And then we get into struggling with things like trying to keep a fresh face and things like that. So yeah, it really just comes down to how many pounds of this are you going to feed? And hopefully your nutritionist or your seed guy or somebody can help you, like give you an idea what the quality is going to be before you ever grow the product. And that way you can make those management decisions. How many acres do we need to plant to get this kind of inclusion rate of this quality of feed? And then how are we going to manage it to make sure that happens?
yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. One of the things that we talked about quite a bit on last week's discussion was the importance of a team approach when it comes to, well, in that case, we were talking about silage harvest, but I think that really ties in here. Daniel tried to get the extension specialist fired, but besides that, I think, it's really, it's important to work as a team, and that team can consist of not just your nutritionist and your veterinarian, but pulling in agronomists as well. I think we talked about that last week, and I think it really ties in very well with this conversation too. It's always better to have the team approach at the beginning when you're approaching these issues before, versus having a team approach at the end when you're trying to figure out what to do with a product that may not be the best for your goals and your needs on your farm.
Exactly. Yeah, when I started Forage Innovations, that was the whole goal behind it, was to kind of sit in the middle between the agronomist and the nutritionist, and be able to kind of pull that together. Because so often nutritionists get really frustrated because basically the farmer makes this whole pile of feed and says, hey, go for it, now it's your job to make milk out of it. Or sometimes the agronomist isn't included fourth year BMR corn on corn, and it's important to get everybody together, get them all at the table, and put mock rations together based on expectations, and then work back from there.
Maybe we can end with some last thoughts from both of our speakers. Where's the best place, if we have people who are listening who are maybe just interested in starting to do cover crops, either for conservation purposes or for feed purposes, where's the best place for them to start? And Rebecca, I think you talked about this a little bit.
Go first.
Yeah, you talked about this a little bit in your presentation. So,
I mean, if you're totally new and you want to start out, I'd look for easy entry points on like where to, test it and try different things. Or maybe you've tried cover crops and you want to try something different, like a different mix or something. Look for those easy entry points, like after corn silage. Or if you're looking at, a different type of rotation, besides, just corn, where we're going to get in earlier. Those are easy points. I always recommend starting off small. It's a lot easier to have an oops with 10 acres than it is to have an oops with, 100 or even 1,000 acres. And just, try to figure out what works best, and don't be afraid to play around. Every year is a little bit different. So just because something didn't work one year, I wouldn't say that it would never work. We might need to make some, changes and try something different, or try it again the next year, and just be flexible. And
yeah, I would say, of course, local advice is the more local you can get, the better. So, something that's working for your neighbor, talk to your extension agent and get them involved, or whatever. But certainly on a local level, that's the best. We try to have a lot of resources on our website, but there's lots of other places that you can go. And I feel like probably one of the challenges is trying to find stuff that's applicable to your farm, to your location, because there's a lot of information out there on cover crops and forages that just don't work in your area because of the lack of growing days or whatever. And so that's the real challenge, is trying to find stuff that actually works on your situation. As far as just kind of last thoughts here, I would just say, that it's so exciting that the world of alternative forages and cover crops, there's so many different directions you can go. Going beyond just cereal rye, or going beyond just tillage radishes. But you just got to figure out that system and what actually works. But thankfully, we have lots and lots of tools, and there's lots of things to try. That's
really exciting. All right. Well, I want to thank our speakers for this evening, our panelists. Really some great discussion, good Q&A, a lot of insight.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.